Glen Canyon Dam is failing right now, not cracking, not crumbling, something quieter and far more dangerous than that. 40 million people depend on water flowing through this structure, and the pipes built to deliver that water when everything else fails are already damaged. The Bureau of Reclamation knows this. They wrote it in a technical memorandum in March of 2024. Then they chose not to publish it. And the reservoir behind the dam is draining toward the exact threshold where those damaged pipes become the only option fast enough that the Bureau's own projections show it happening before the end of this year. That document, obtained and released by outside researchers, describes a dam operating at the edge of what its own infrastructure can physically handle. It describes bypass tubes that erode under the pressure required to use them. It acknowledges that the instruments built to measure the reservoir's water level stop working below the danger threshold because the engineers who designed this dam in the 1950s never included a gauge for elevations they believed were impossible. And it concludes with a recommendation that should be on the front page of every newspaper in the American West. The Bureau of Reclamation should not rely on these pipes as the sole means of releasing water from Glen Canyon Dam. They are currently the only means available. 40 million people. That is the number that keeps appearing in every document, every warning, every letter that the states downstream have sent to the federal government. 40 million people in 7 states who depend on water flowing through Glen Canyon Dam to reach their taps, their farms, their cities. Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Tucson, San Diego, Denver, Salt Lake City, the entire agricultural engine of the Imperial Valley in California, 700,000 acres, that produce 2/3 of America's winter vegetables. All of it downstream of a 710-foot wall of concrete built in the Arizona desert during an era when the federal government believed that damming a river was the same thing as controlling it. Lake Powell today sits at 3,528 feet above sea level. The threshold where the dam stops functioning as a water delivery system is 3,490 feet. That gap is 38 feet. The lake is losing elevation at roughly 1/10 of a foot per day. The snowpack feeding the Rocky Mountain rivers that fill this reservoir has collapsed to the absolute floor of recorded history, the 0th percentile. Not the bottom, 10%, the bottom. The forecasted spring runoff for April through July of 2026 has been revised down 3 times in 3 months, landing at 27% of average. The Bureau of Reclamation's own March projections show Lake Powell ending 2026 below minimum power pool under the most probable scenario. This is not a warning about something that might happen. This is a description of a trajectory that is already in motion. Here is what nobody is talking about. The problem is not just the drought. The problem is not just the math of 7 states fighting over water a river cannot deliver. The problem hiding inside all of that, the one that could turn a water shortage into a water emergency overnight, is a structural flaw at the heart of the dam itself. A flaw the Bureau documented, classified, and declined to fix. A flaw that becomes catastrophic at exactly the moment the drought is worst. To understand what is broken, you have to understand how Glen Canyon Dam actually works, and that requires going back to 1956 when construction began, and to the man who built it. Floyd Dominy was the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation from 1959 to 1969. He was not an engineer by training. He was a farmer from Nebraska who had watched drought destroy everything his family built, and he became the most powerful water bureaucrat in American history by sheer force of will and political savagery. Dominy did not build Glen Canyon Dam because the science demanded it. He built it because he wanted it built. He wanted the Colorado River controlled. He wanted the desert converted into farmland and cities. He wanted a monument. The engineers who designed the dam built it for a world that does not exist anymore. They positioned the intake pipes, the penstocks that feed water to the 8 turbines, at an elevation of 3,470 feet. They set the minimum operating level at 3,490 feet, 20 feet above those intakes, because below that threshold, the water would form vortices, whirlpools that suck air down into the turbines, creating explosive vapor bubbles that destroy steel and concrete from the inside. They called this process cavitation. They were right to fear it. What they did not do was install a measurement gauge below that level. The Bureau's own 2024 memorandum confirms this. The stilling well, the instrument that tracks reservoir elevation, ends at 3,477 feet. Below the danger line, if the water drops past that point, the Bureau of Reclamation cannot read their own gauge. They will be operating blind inside the most critical water infrastructure in the American West. But the design flaw that nobody is talking about is not the penstocks. It is what happens after the penstocks close. When Lake Powell drops below 3,490 feet and the turbines must be shut down to prevent cavitation, there is only one remaining way to pass water through the dam to the 40 million people downstream. 4 steel pipes, each 96 inches in diameter, running 930 feet through the base of the dam. They are called the River Outlet Works. Engineers call them the bypass tubes. They were designed in 1964 for temporary use during the dam's initial construction, not as a permanent water delivery system. The manual from that year says so explicitly. Their purpose was to maintain minimum downstream river flow before the power plant was operational. They were never meant to be the last line of defense for a civilization. These tubes have a problem that the Bureau understood before they ever used them for their current purpose. When the reservoir is low and pressure is weak, water moving through these pipes at high velocity crosses a threshold where the local pressure drops below the vapor pressure of water. Bubbles of vapor form. Then, a fraction of a second later, they implode. Each implosion generates a shockwave powerful enough to pit steel. Over time, not decades, not years, sometimes weeks, cavitation strips metal away like sandpaper on wood, creating craters inside pipes that are supposed to be carrying the water supply of half the American West. The Bureau's own hydraulic engineers described it plainly in their 2024 document. Cavitation is destructive, as bubbles implode against flow surfaces and create extremely high pressures that can, over time, erode all types of solid materials. In April of 2023, the Bureau used the bypass tubes for the first time in years, a 7 2-hour test release at 3,500 cubic feet per second per tube. When the inspectors went in afterward, they found damage. Pitting on the steel lining, erosion patterns matching the damage first observed in 1965, the year the dam initially came online. The resin coating inside the pipes, a 1/25 thousandths of an inch layer of coal tar enamel that was already 60 years old, was compromised. The Bureau responded with an $8.9 million relining project in 2024, new epoxy primer, new polysiloxane topcoat, applied by robots. But the Bureau itself acknowledged what the repairs did and did not accomplish. The relining addressed corrosion protection. It did not address cavitation. The same forces that damaged the pipes in 2023 will damage them again, more severely at lower water levels. And the Bureau has already restricted how much water can flow through them. Tables in the 2024 memorandum show that at 3,430 feet, the combined capacity of all 4 tubes is only enough to deliver 7.41 million acre-feet per year. The legal obligation to the lower basin states is 8.23 million acre-feet. The dam becomes physically incapable of meeting the law before it even reaches dead pool. Here is what that means in plain language. There is a level above zero where Glen Canyon Dam stops being a dam and becomes a wall with water behind it that cannot get out fast enough to supply the cities that were built to receive it. The Bureau knows exactly where that level is. They calculated it, they wrote it in a document. They did not publish the document. But this is not the first time the Bureau concealed how close to catastrophe this dam has come. To understand the full scope of what has been hidden, you have to go back to June of 1983. The winter of 1982 to 1983 brought the most powerful El Niño event ever recorded to that point. The Rocky Mountains received snowfall so extreme that in some parts of Colorado, nearly 70 feet accumulated over the course of the season. The Bureau of Reclamation understood by January that inflows would be at least 10% above normal. Lake Powell was already at 90% of capacity. The Bureau released half the water it could have, By late May, Lake Powell was rising a foot per day and the reservoir was at 96%, more water than on January 1st. On June 6th, before dawn, the operators heard a sound they had never heard before, a deep resonance coming from inside the dam structure itself. The operations chief, Tom Gamble, was called at home in the middle of the night. When he stood over the spillway at dawn, the water that should have been a clean white arc was carrying something else. Chunks of material the size of office chairs launching into the canyon below. The white water had turned red. That color meant one thing: the 3-foot reinforced concrete lining of the spillway tunnel had been breached. The native Navajo sandstone underneath was being eroded. Cavitation had begun. A Bureau employee in the cafeteria at the base of the dam, a Vietnam veteran, said it sounded like artillery bombardments. The roar could be heard 4 miles downstream. Large waves agitated the river surface 2 miles away. Manhole covers throughout the dam complex lifted from their frames. Springs erupted from the canyon walls. When engineer Phil Berge was lowered into the damaged spillway on a cable car while the entire mass of Lake Powell sat directly behind the gate above his head, he found a progression of craters. Then one he could not pass. A hole 10 to 12 feet long, 2 to 3 feet deep, carved through steel-reinforced concrete and into the sandstone of the canyon wall. It was caused by a single calcium carbonate deposit, 6.5 millimeters tall, a protrusion 2,000 times smaller than the tunnel's diameter that had initiated the entire chain of destruction. Berge came back up and said they could not release any more water through that tunnel. When the tunnels were drained in August, what the engineers found was beyond any damage they had modeled. In the left spillway, a crater 35 feet deep, 134 feet long, and 50 feet wide. A block of sandstone 10 by 15 feet sitting in the middle of the tunnel floor. Electrician Art Grosh described it. There were holes so big you could put a house in them. Rebar the size of hot dogs, just twisted. 1-inch rebar had been pulled out of the concrete like bones from a cooked fish. The Bureau's public communications during the entire crisis said the same thing, in one variation after another. The dam was never in danger. Operations Chief Tom Gamble told reporters there was no fear of jeopardy to the dam. The Bureau's official spokesperson called it a routine operational event. What the Bureau said internally was different. An internal report acknowledged that when the damage was first reported on June 6th, the concern was for the safety of the dam and its foundation, and that this concern predominated throughout the entire spill period. What the Bureau said in private, that it could not say in public, was documented by Steve Hannon, a Bureau historian who had direct access to internal communications. The growing terror during those weeks, he wrote, was that the plunging water, now working on the abutment at 1,000 tons per second, would erode enough sandstone to create a connection to the bottom of the reservoir. If that happened, there would be no way to stop a leak that would grow uncontrollably, cutting like a liquid laser through the Aeolian rock. The entire reservoir would drain. A future commissioner of the Bureau later stated, simply, "We came a hell of a lot closer to losing Glen Canyon in 1983 than many people know." Researchers estimated that if Lake Powell had emptied, a 580-foot wall of water would have swept through the Grand Canyon at 25 miles per hour. A 70-foot wave would have overtopped Hoover Dam 300 miles downstream, almost certainly destroying it. Every dam on the lower river would have fallen in sequence to the Gulf of California. The Bureau repaired the tunnels for $37 million, added ventilation slots, and continued operating the dam exactly as before. They did not redesign the spillways. They did not install lower bypass capacity. They operated under a principle their own public affairs officer articulated: a well-managed reservoir should almost never spill. The assumption buried inside that sentence, that management could always prevent the worst, is the same assumption that is now failing in slow motion as Lake Powell falls toward the threshold those engineers never thought it would reach. Here is the thing about the bypass tubes that the Bureau has never said publicly. The same cavitation that destroyed the spillway tunnels in 1983 is the same process that is eating the bypass tubes today. Different pipes, different year, same physics. The Bureau repaired the 1,000, 20,983 damage and called it solved. They repaired the 2023 damage and called it solved. But the Bureau's own technical tables show that every foot Lake Powell drops below 3,490 increases the cavitation risk inside those tubes. The repairs are not solutions. They are patches on a dam that was never designed for the conditions it now faces. The states that depend on this water know exactly how precarious the situation is. California, Arizona, and Nevada sent a 26-page letter to Interior Secretary Doug Burgum in February of 2025. The letter accused the Bureau of Reclamation of violating federal environmental law, not bending the rules, violating NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, by refusing to include any options for dam infrastructure modifications in the environmental review currently underway for post-2026 river operations. The letter stated directly that addressing the infrastructure limitations may be the one long-term measure that would best achieve the operation and management improvements needed for the Colorado River. The Bureau has not formally responded. The post-2026 operating rules for the entire Colorado River were supposed to be negotiated by November of 2025, then by February 14, 2026. Both deadlines passed without agreement. Nevada's John Ensminger described the negotiations as having yielded almost no headway, bogged down by the same tired rhetoric and entrenched positions. The Upper Basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, argue that they already take cuts every dry year and should not be penalized for consuming less than their legal allocation. The Lower Basin states point out that Arizona has already cut 800,000 acre-feet annually, that California's water use fell to its lowest level since 1949. Everyone is already in pain. Nobody agrees on who absorbs the rest. And underneath all of that political paralysis, Lake Powell keeps falling. The snowpack of 2026 did what no winter on record has ever done. It collapsed to the 0th percentile. Not the bottom 10%, the absolute floor of 60 years of recorded data. An early heat wave in late March accelerated snowmelt before it could accumulate. The critical April through July runoff window, the one that historically rescues the reservoir, is projected at 27% of average. The Bureau of Reclamation's March 2026 month study shows Lake Powell ending the calendar year below minimum power pool under the most probable scenario. Under the minimum probable scenario, it ends the year at 3,000 to 470 feet, 20 feet below the threshold, in the zone where even the damaged bypass tubes begin to fail. This is also the moment when the 1,922 Colorado River Compact, the agreement that divided all this water more than a century ago, reveals its foundational lie. The negotiators measured the river during the wettest 2 decades in 1,300 years and wrote those numbers into law. Researchers at UCLA reconstructed river flows from tree ring data going back 12 centuries and found the true long-term average is 13.2 to 14.3 million acre-feet per year. The compact promised 16.5 million. The river has never reliably delivered what was promised. The math has been broken since 1922. The drought has simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. There is one more thing that nobody talks about in the coverage of this crisis: the sediment. Every year, an estimated 45 to 100 million tons of silt and debris flow into Lake Powell from the Colorado and its tributaries. Since 1963, the reservoir has lost almost 7% of its storage capacity to sediment that has settled on the bottom and will never leave. USGS researchers drilling sediment cores found heavy metals from a century of upstream mining: arsenic, lead, mercury, uranium. That sediment is not stable. When water levels drop and the upper arms of the lake are exposed, the accumulated banks, in some places 40 to 60 feet high, become vulnerable to mass erosion. One large flash flood could mobilize years of sediment into the main body of the reservoir in hours. Floyd Dominy, when asked about this problem decades ago, said, "We will let people in the future worry about it. The future is here." The engineers who built Glen Canyon Dam believed they had built something permanent. The Bureau of Reclamation has spent 60 years managing it as though it were permanent. the 1,922 compact promised water from a river that cannot deliver what was promised. And when the Bureau's own technicians finally wrote down, in a document dated March 26, 2024, that the bypass tubes should not be relied upon as the sole means of releasing water from the dam, they were describing a situation that already exists. Those tubes are already the only option. They are already damaged. And in the most probable scenario, Lake Powell reaches the level where they must carry everything, all 40 million people's water, sometime before the end of this year. The dam is not going to crack. It is not going to collapse in a single dramatic failure. What is going to happen is quieter and harder to film. A 710-foot wall of concrete will simply run out of the infrastructure it needs to do the one job it was built for. Dan Beard ran the Bureau of Reclamation for 2 years in the 1990s. He has spent the decades since that job trying to undo what the agency he led has built. His verdict on Glen Canyon Dam: it is a deadbeat. Something that takes from the river and the people without paying what it owes. He wants it removed. More quietly, the engineers who study it say the same thing in different language. The dam will need to be modified. It is just a matter of when. The question that the Bureau's unpublished memorandum, the state's unanswered letter, and the 0 percentile snowpack are all pointing toward at the same time is the same question that Floyd Dominy never had to answer. Zach Frankel, director of the Utah Rivers Council and one of the foremost technical voices on this crisis, put it without hesitation: it's not if, but when. The likelihood that Lake Powell reaches dead pool is all but guaranteed. He added something that no federal official has been willing to say out loud: modifying Glen Canyon Dam to ensure water can bypass it at river level is the only way forward for the rest of the 21st century. Anything else is climate change denial that requires 40 million people to pay the price with emergency water cuts. Before he died, Floyd Dominy sat across from an environmentalist who had fought him his entire career. He took a cocktail napkin. He drew the tunnels that would need to be bored through the sandstone around his dam to let the river pass at ground level. He drew the valves that would need to be installed. He signed it. He handed it over. The man who built Glen Canyon Dam spent his last years sketching how to bypass it. The Bureau of Reclamation has not published a formal response to the 3 states that accuse them of breaking federal law. The bypass tunnels have not been authorized. The 7 states have not reached a new agreement on who gets less. Lake Powell sits at 3,528 feet, dropping roughly 1/10 of a foot per day, heading toward a threshold its own designers never thought to measure. 3,490 is not a prediction anymore. It is a direction,